Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this study of the book of Genesis. Today is episode number 15. We are in Genesis 7, verses 17 through 24. This is a wrap up of chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we have been looking at the account of the flood. Now, God had, in the first 6 chapters we covered, God saw the population explode in the world, but he also saw that the people's hearts and minds were corrupt and wicked. The thoughts of and the intentions of the heart was wicked only all the time, evil all the time. There was demonic activity. There was an explosion of population. There was not only the corruption and violence, but there was incredible amounts of sexual perversion. And God had finally had enough, and he decided that that was it, and the wrath of God came. Now, that is a foreshadowing of the wrath of God that will come at the end of days. When the Lord returns, there will be an incredible wrath poured out upon the world because of the same situations: the exploding population, the sexual perversion, the corruption corruption and violence that would spread around the world, and also the thoughts and the intents of every heart was only evil all the time. And so that parallel will carry forward into the last days, into the time of the return of the Lord and his wrath being poured out on the world. Now he looked and he saw a family, though, that was they had found grace in the eyes of the Lord, it said. This family was going to be protected, and they were going to be protected because they were righteous. In fact, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, all you and your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." So Noah's generation, that was very much similar to the generation of the last days, Noah was alone righteous in that generation. And Noah would be saved because he was righteous in that generation. The same thing is going to be true in our generation. If our generation is the last generation, if we are at the end of days, and we don't know that for sure because not all of those signs have been fulfilled, but our generation will parallel his, and God will be looking for people who are faithful and righteous in that last generation. Just as Noah was righteous in his generation, we are to be righteous in our generation, and that is something the Lord sees, and that is something that the Lord responds to in his grace. We find righteousness not of our own. We don't have righteousness on our own. Our righteousness is deprived from Jesus himself. We are given the righteousness of Christ. We are imputed with righteousness. That's the covering of righteousness. And we are imparted with righteousness. That's the change, the transformative power in our hearts. But it doesn't stop there. Because when you are righteous, you want to do what Noah did. Noah walked with God. Noah was blameless before God. Noah was obedient before God. Noah sought after God. And that's the same for us today. We want to follow God. We want to know God. We want to walk with God. We want to be obedient toward God. We want to be found in Christ. That is the ultimate goal. So God will be looking for, in the final generation, people like Noah who are willing to be faithful despite what is going on in the world around him. And Noah was that man, and you and I can be those people here today if this is the last generation, because we are walking in righteousness with him, and we are trusting in him, and we are not looking to our own self-efforts, but purely looking to him for his grace that he pours out to us. Well, let's account for the rest of this story of the book of Genesis. We're going to pick it up in chapter 17, so let's turn to that. So starting in verse 17, and again, let me give you just the quick reminder. God said to Noah, "Get in the ark." Noah got in the ark along with his family. He then brought all of these animals into the ark, which would have not been a problem for God. God could have turned on that migratory instinct and drawn the animals there. They had plenty of food. The ark was far large enough to be able to do this. The estimates of the ark would be many, many thousands of animals that could have been held on this ark. So the boat was big enough, the ark was big enough to be able to handle all that was going to happen. God had said to Noah, again, you get in the ark, and you're going to get in there because I've seen that you're righteous, you walk with me, you're obedient toward me. And Noah and his family found grace and favor in the eyes of the Lord. Now, once they had gotten on the ark, the door was shut, and then it was too late for everyone else. Once the door is shut, then the window is closed. There's no more opportunity, no more chance, no more possibility that somebody could climb on the ark. It was done. It was closed, and that was it. Once the door was shut, then the rain started to fall. Now we know in looking at the account of Genesis that the rain would have been more than we could probably even fathom, even imagine in our minds, because the rain would have been part of the water vapor in the sky that would have been released, and it would have been worldwide in nature. This was not a localized flood. This was a worldwide event that was going on. The water vapor barrier was released, and also waters came up from the depths. And so you had a massive amount of water that was all of a sudden hitting the world and would cause this great catastrophic change to the world, and it's the world that we know today. The world that was pre-flood is something that we don't even have a good handle on. We can imagine, we can come up with scenarios, but we don't have a really good handle on it because it's beyond our ability to comprehend. So this world at that time that would have been lush, full of vegetation, people being living for ages, billions of people probably on the earth, all kinds of animals that would have not survived the flood, that would have not been chosen to go on the ark. All of these would have become the really just part of the really the oil and the coal seams that run throughout the world, the organic material that would have been trapped amongst the changing flood powers, the changing waters, the changing landscapes that would have come out of all of this. Once the door was shut, the waters came. Now we get into verse 17 of chapter 7 and what the events were actually going to do. So we're just going to look at these 7 verses today, and then we are going to, we'll wrap it up for today, wrap up chapter 7. So it says this, now the flood was on the earth for 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. Now, just note this, that even though the flood was on the earth for 40 days, that's the rainfall part of it. That is not the length of time that they would spend in the ark. This is the amount of time that the water was covering, and once that water was covering, there was nothing else that could be done. You had to stay on that boat until all of it would subside to the point that they could actually go onto dry land. And we'll see that later in Genesis. But it says the floodwaters were on the earth for 40 days. The waters increased. It lifted up the ark. Now, again, the ark would have been this big rectangular shape. It was not meant to navigate or circumnavigate the globe. It was just meant to keep them safe until the floodwaters receded and they could step out on dry lands. So it was the waters prevailed. They greatly increased on the earth. The ark moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And so the description that is going on that's important to understand is that this is, again, this is not a local flood that was going on. The biblical record, despite what some claims are put out there, this is a global event. This is happening around the globe. This is not an isolated incident. This is happening all around the world. If this were not a global flood, then the ark really would have not been necessary. He could have just said to them, go to this other location, and there you'll be safe, and I'm going to flood this other location. If that were the case, again, they would have not needed an ark. If it were a local flood, then God's promise to never again bring a flood like this would be false, because he's brought local floods. Local floods have happened all over the globe since this time. God promised this would never happen again. So this had to be a global flood. If it were only a local flood, the Bible is wrong when it traces all of humanity back to Noah's sons. And other passages that speak of a universal flood, like Psalm 104 and 2 Peter 3. If it was only a local flood, then you don't have to trace everybody back to Noah's sons. They didn't need an ark. They could have just gone on wherever they wanted to go and just escape the flood. And if it was not a global flood, then this account of a local flood, that when the Bible says, or God says, I will never again do this, we know that God then would be a liar, because he has done floods before. There have been floods since this time. So we know that it has to be a global flood in nature. It can't possibly be just a local flood. Now, what's interesting about this, and maybe you've not heard this before, but there are literally hundreds of people groups around the world that have their own accounts and legends of the flood. One of the most remarkable is the Babylonian account, which is very similar to the Genesis account in many ways, and it clearly draws from it. Since all mankind drives and comes out of Noah's sons, all mankind would remember the flood, which is why all of these different people groups have an account of the flood in their culture. There are legends of of a tribe in New Guinea. There's a legends of the Indians of certain different Americans, the South America and North America. There are Peruvian Indians, Africans. There are natives of Greenland, natives of the Hawaiian Islands. There are Hindus, Chinese, Egyptians, Greeks, Persians, Australian natives, the Welsh, Celts, Druids, Siberians, and Lithuanians, just to name a handful, that all have an account of the flood in their history and in their culture. In fact, of the more than 200 cultures that have an account of their own account of the flood, the following aspects of the stories are common. So listen to this. Of all of these 200 cultures that have an account of the flood, of the 200, here are the commonalities in every culture. 88% of the 200 describe a very favored family in this flood. Well, that's Noah's family. 70% attribute survival to a boat. 95% say the sole cause of the catastrophe was, in fact, a flood. 66% of these groups say that the disaster is due to man's wickedness. 67% record that animals are also saved. 57% describe that the survivors ended up on a mountain, and that's the most common belief, is that the ark itself came to rest on a specific mountain. Many of these accounts also specifically mention birds being sent out, a rainbow, and 8 persons being saved. So this account of the flood is not limited to the Bible. It is in almost a large percentage of the cultures around the world. 200 cultures specifically describe all of these events in common that are just identical to what the Bible describes as the flood event that was the catastrophic event that changed the world. This favored family, this family of 8 that were saved due to a flood because of the wickedness of mankind. They were saved in a boat. They came to rest on a mountain. Animals were part of this. The rainbow was a sign of this, and there were birds that were sent out. That can't be a coincidence. The Bible is not something that is just a made-up story. There are evidences of it around the world, and there are cultures that speak to the truth and the reality of this event. Now, the water was so high that the mountains were covered. Now, this would have taken a lot of water. Now, most likely, the mountains of the time of before the flood, the time of Noah building up to the flood, most likely the mountains were not to the same levels that they were during the pre-flood stage. Really, think about and look at, just with your own eyes, look at how the water could have transformed the landscape. If you drive across the country, or if you go to another country and you drive through their country and you look at the landscape, and just imagine in your mind, if water was present, could that have created the things that we see today? And the answer to that is absolutely true. It absolutely could easily create the things that we see today. So the mountains may have not been as high. It could have been activity, earthquake activity, the water eroding things away, but the landscape would have changed. Nevertheless, it was enough water that it covered the face of the world. There was nowhere for the ark to come to rest until the waters started to recede. Well, let's keep going. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle, and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. I want you to note that word and note what is being said here. He said specifically these words, and just highlight these for yourself. He said, all that had the, let me see here, all that had the breath of the Spirit of life, all was on the dry land died. Okay, so all that had the breath of the Spirit of life. There was a famous trial that took place that many of you would remember, or at least you've heard stories about or you've read about, and it was called the Scopes Monkey Trials. It was back in 1925. Clarence Darrow really humiliated William Jennings Bryan by asking him if he believed every word of the Bible. When Bryan said he did, Darrow asked him how the fish drowned in the flood. Bryan didn't know the answer. He gave a long and confusing speech, and he died the next day. If only he had known his Bible better, he would have realized that the fish did not die in the seas when the flood happened. Who died? Everyone who had the breath of the Spirit of life. Now, who had the breath? Who is the one that has the breath of the Spirit of life? Well, that is mankind. Mankind are the only ones that have the breath of the Spirit of life. Animals don't have the breath of the Spirit of life. We've had many pets in our household as our kids have grown up and gotten older over the years. We've had not only hamsters and fish, we've had cats and dogs, we've had horses. We've had animals that have died. And they have become part of the family, and we have been very close to them and love them, and they were a gift to the family. But animals don't have the Spirit of life. Animals, as sad as it is, I don't believe that they go to heaven because they don't have the Spirit of life. God did not breathe life into them. He breathed it into mankind. Who was it that died in the flood? Well, the birds died, the cattle died, and the beasts and every creeping thing that creeps along the earth, they died. The fish didn't die. They were in the waters, and they could not die because they were in the waters. But who else died? Every man, every person, the ones who had the breath of the Spirit of life, the ones that were on the dry land, they're the ones that died. Now, again, this incredible catastrophe, this incredible event that would have occurred, you would have had vegetation, you would have had animals, you would have had, and we have evidences of this because we have fossil records from everywhere, fossil records that are amazing that really date back to the flood times. But you had vegetation, lush green vegetation, you had animals, and you had mankind. And again, if you look at those things, the organic matter that would have been a part of these, this is what would have made up today what we know as some of the oil and the coal reserves. And I know it's kind of morbid to think about some of that, but that's really the organic material that would have created these, buried under layers and layers of dirt, some very close to the surface, others buried very, very deep in the earth. And that's because of the flood event that happened. God destroyed everything that was on the dry land. The fish did not die in that process. It doesn't say anything about them dying in the process. They would have survived and lived in that. It's why God probably didn't bring pairs of fish on the ark, because there was no need for that to happen. So it says he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground. They were not in the waters, they were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him on the ark remained alive. Again, what does the ark do? The ark is our safety. The ark is our protection. The ark is what carries us through the wrath of God that will come. Now we will, again, one day, the wrath of God will be poured out. This time we don't have a boat that we climb in. This time our ark, again, is in what we have talked about many times. Our ark is Christ himself. Jesus, the Christ, Jesus, the Messiah, Yeshua, the one who saves, is the one that we climb into for safety today. Jesus opens the door, and there will come a point that he will also shut the door. The door will be shut, and there will be no more opportunities. Only those that are in Jesus, in the ark, will remain alive and be saved. And one final verse in chapter 7. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So what happened during these 150 days? Well, some suggest that God probably put some of the animals into a period of hibernation for this time. Many animals have a hibernation cycle that they go through. That hibernation cycle it always means less food, less space, less supervision was needed, less water is going to be needed. So God could have very possibly put the animals into a hibernation period while they're there. God provides animals today with this incredible instinct for hibernation, so it wouldn't be impossible or improbable even that God put them into some kind of a hibernation state. For 150 days, God sustained them on the ark. Now, what would that be? The 150 days, probably 5 months of time. The Jewish calendar goes by 30-day increments, so we're looking at 150 days being 5 months that they would have been there on the ark. God kept them safe. God sustained them. God provided for them. God helped them. God helped the animals. God took care of the animals until the day was done and they could finally step out of the ark. So for the period of 150 days, God took care of them and sustained them. Now, that's not the end of it, because there's going to be a few more days that you're going to see as we get into chapter 8 before they can actually get out of the ark. But God would sustain them, protect them through the time of storm and flood, the way that he protects us and sustains us today. We go through times of storms. We go through times of floods. Now, they may not be literal. They may be more metaphorical and more spiritual in nature. But God sustains and God protects, and God will be with you every step of the way through whatever storms, whatever trials, whatever hardships you face. What is God looking for in the wrath to come? He's looking for people who will, number one, who will trust him. Number two, will walk with him. Number three, will obey him. Number four, be committed to him. This is the kind of people that God is looking for today in this generation. And it's the same kind of person that Noah was then in his generation. Well, that's all we have for chapter 7. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you back here next time.